Welcome to Bethesda Green's Innovation Lab's Summer Speaker Series, Tackling Environmental Challenges Through Sustainable Entrepreneurship. During this series, we will discuss ideas that impact people, the planet, and profits. My name is Patty Simonton, and I'm the director of the Be Green Business Program here at Bethesda Green. Thank you for taking the time to join us for the second session of the summer series, where we'll discuss the economic impact of climate change on our region's food supply. This session is being recorded. I invite you all to use the chat to introduce yourselves and share any questions you may have for our panelists. I'll do my best to incorporate audience questions throughout the conversation and during the Q&A session at the end. As our region responds to the constantly changing environmental pressures caused by climate change and political socio-economic pressures, scientists, farmers, and some policymakers are increasingly sounding the alarm about the need to protect our food supply. The potential disastrous impacts of climate change on our food supply is worrisome, but some see an opportunity for innovation and economic growth. For today's conversation, I'm pleased to welcome three panelists who can speak to the economic opportunities and challenges facing our region as climate change continues to strain our food supply. Amy Jacobs is the Chesapeake Agriculture Program Director for Maryland and DC at the Nature Conservancy. Amy joined the Maryland DC chapter in 2011 and leads their efforts to improve water quality in agricultural landscapes across the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Her collaborative efforts are focused across multiple states, working with Nature Conservancy colleagues, as well as farmers and agribusinesses to implement change in agricultural systems to meet their ambitious goals. This work directly supports the Nature Conservancy's global goal of reducing nutrient runoff in agricultural watersheds, with the goal of improving water quality and reducing dead zones in our estuaries. Dr. Darren H. Jarboe is the Assistant Director and Program Leader for the Agriculture and Food Systems Program at University of Maryland Extension. He leads a team of 36 Extension faculty who conduct applied research, develop and deliver research-based educational programs, and serve communities in Maryland. Prior to arriving at UME, he was a program manager for technology commercialization, marketing, and communications at the Iowa State University Center for Crops Utilization Research and the BioCentury Research Farm, focusing on commercializing technologies in the food, feed, and biorenewable sector. He co-founded GrossWen Technologies, Inc., a startup company commercializing an algal wastewater treatment technology. Darren holds bachelor degrees in agronomy and agricultural business, a master's of science in business administration, and a PhD in industrial and agricultural technology, all from Iowa State University. John Torres is the Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer of the Maryland Farm Bureau, the largest and oldest general farm organization in the state of Maryland. Prior to joining Maryland Farm Bureau, John served as the Director of Government and Industry Affairs for Ohio Corn and Wheat Growers Association, where he oversaw the legislative activities for the statewide organization, including the coordination of legislative and regulatory actions at both the state and federal levels, and managed the organization's Political Action Committee. Prior to that, John spent 5 years at American Farm Bureau Federation in Washington, D.C. As Director of Leadership Development, started his Farm Bureau career as an organization director for the Ohio Farm Bureau. For the Ohio Farm Bureau Federation, managing local county Farm Bureau organizations. Before working in the world of agricultural associations, John was a commodities trader for Archer Daniels Midland, a Fortune 100 multinational and publicly traded company based in Chicago, Illinois. Whew, you guys are awesome. Thank you all for being here. Let's get things started. Agriculture in Maryland and the Chesapeake region is extremely diverse. In addition to food crops, agriculture here includes dairy and livestock, poultry, honey, horticulture, and vineyards. That doesn't even include the Chesapeake Bay itself. According to NOAA, the Chesapeake Bay is the nation's largest estuary. Its 64,000 square mile watershed encompasses one of the most economically significant regions in the United States and is home to more than 18 million people. The Chesapeake produces about 500 million pounds of seafood each year, supporting jobs in both commercial and recreational fishing and bolstering the regional economy. But as storms become even more severe, water levels rise, and severe heat and risks of drought impact our farmland, farmers must adapt. Amy, we're going to kick this off with you. Scientists predict the Chesapeake Bay could rise by over 2 feet by 2050, and an increase in rainfall will cause an increase in the runoff of nutrients used in agriculture. Could you please get us started by telling us a little bit more about your work at the Nature Conservancy and what you're seeing happening here in the region with regards to water quality in agricultural landscapes as climate change tightens its grip?
Absolutely. Thanks, Patty, and thanks for having me today. It's really nice to see so many people on the call. And I'm honored to be here with John and Darren, real farm advocates in Maryland, to work together to solve some of these big challenges we have. So the Nature Conservancy is a global conservation organization. We work in every state in the US and over 72 countries around the world to find solutions to some of our most pressing environmental challenges that we have. And specifically, our organization is really focused now on climate change and biodiversity. So in the Chesapeake, water quality is our limiting factor to restoring biodiversity in the Chesapeake Bay. And we know, as Patty just articulated some, it's going to get harder as our climate continues to change. So based on interviews that we've been doing as part of a study in collaboration with the Maryland grain producers and funded by the Harry Hughes Center for Agroecology about climate resiliency, farmers are telling us that they're being impacted and seeing by the increasing severity of storms, increasing heat index, that it's getting hotter for longer periods of time, and that drought is being longer and affecting their production. And everyone we've talked to so far expects that it's going to continue to get worse. The good news around this is that many of the ways that we can improve water quality are also the same techniques and the same practices that can build climate resiliency within our food system and within our agricultural production systems. And they often can make economic sense for farmers. So the Nature Conservancy is focused on two key areas in the Chesapeake Bay in our agriculture work. The first is precision nutrient management. So ensuring that nutrients that are applied to grow crops, that they're able to be used by the plants, leaving less behind to get into our waterways. So how farmers apply their fertilizers can make a big difference in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and also improve water quality in the bay. And the second area we're focused on is restoring nature in priority locations across the landscape that can filter nutrients that do leave fields and store and slow water from the increasing rain and heavy rain events, and while also providing habitat for plants and animals to adapt to these changing conditions. So since 1985, farmers have already reduced nitrogen in the Bay watershed by 24% and phosphorus by 45%. But we still have more work to do, but I do think there's a positive story in this, and I think that Maryland is in a good place and has really amazing farmers that can work together to achieve these goals.
Wonderful, thank you for that. John, through the work at the Maryland Farm Bureau, what are some of the major challenges you see affecting farmers and consumers in regards to growing and accessing food in the state?
Hi, Patty. Thanks for having me on today. I think there's a few key challenges that I think every sector in business and manufacturing has today, and they're not unique to farming and agriculture. So a few of those that present some challenges to growing that local food economy is number one, labor. And that's something that we've been hearing from all sectors of business across the board. Agriculture and farming and food production is very labor intensive. And so having a qualified workforce that can put in the time and have the skills, competencies needed to grow and raise that food is an ongoing challenge. The second one would be input cost. We have been feeling, consumers and farmers alike, the cost of energy increases. Growing food requires energy, whether it's electricity, whether it's fossil fuels, other forms of energy. The cost to produce food based on what we call inputs continues to increase. Farming is a very low margin business. While we do a great job growing and raising food in this country, our farmers operate on razor thin margins. And so anytime input costs increase, including fertilizer, we've got a lot of petroleum based fertilizers out there. And so when the cost of a barrel of oil goes up, gas goes up, things like that. That eats into those margins and increases the cost of production for farmers across the board. And the third one that I'll highlight is regulations. And from an organizational standpoint, we always talk about the need for common sense regulations. There's a place for regulation in any manufacturing sector, including agriculture, growing and raising food. But when we look at how regulations are structured, often regulations are structured in a way that those who can meet regulatory compliance are larger operations, whether they're farm operations or food manufacturing and processing operations, that have the attorneys, the accountants, the compliance officers to meet that regulatory compliance. When you are growing food on a smaller scale, on a small family farm, you don't have the resources to hire a team of people always to meet that regulatory compliance. And so when we talk about regulations, let's make sure that our regulations are structured in a way that allow for production of all scopes and sizes. And it's not just the larger producers or processors that can meet that regulatory compliance. And I'll give you one example. You know, if folks remember the early days of the pandemic when we were all under lockdown, and you would go to the grocery store and you didn't see your favorite, your meat case packed or your produce aisle packed and things of that nature, we ran into a food resiliency issue where we knew that there was small livestock farmers across the state or across the country, small butcher shops and processing plants across the state and across the country. And the FDA and USDA regulations that allow for us to harvest and process meat and produce lend themselves to larger production. And it's often that red tape that prevents smaller producers and smaller processors from meeting that local demand because of the high regulatory burden that comes along with it. So if we structure those regulations in a way where the smaller producers and smaller processors can provide safe food to local consumers, we eliminate barriers of getting product to market at a much quicker pace. So when we talk about labor, we talk about input costs, and we talk about regulations. Those are things that create barriers to entry for that local food economy to really grow and thrive on a smaller scale.
Hey, thank you for that overview. I mean, I think you're really hitting on a lot of the challenges that businesses face as a whole, but I mean, they're so unique to the food system, right? And the challenges just from the supply chain. And I think we're going to dive into that a little bit later on as well. Thank you. Darren, the University of Maryland Extension is a statewide non-formal education system within the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources and the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. Building on what John just described, can you please highlight some of the challenges our regional food system is facing, specifically those arising as a result of climate change, directly and indirectly, and how the extension programs are uniquely positioned to help address them?
Good afternoon, Patty, and thank you for having me today. There are a lot of things that come with this, and I'm going to mention a few of them. One of the areas that we're working in, and maybe I should mention that extension is not only in Maryland, it's across the United States. Each university, a land grant system, we have extension programs in every state, as well as a number of the territories of the United States. So there'll be a similar program in each of the states to what we have here in Maryland. My team, as was mentioned, are 36 people that are focused on ag and food systems. And some of the things that we're working on or looking at with applied research and educational programming are loss of farmland due to saltwater intrusion. So we're looking at, we may not be able to stop it, but what can we do to help farmers mitigate the issue? Are there crops that they can grow in place of what they're currently growing? We really are the group from the university that takes fundamental research and translates that into useful technologies for out in the field. So we do the training, we do the applied research, we do the demonstrations so that growers can learn to use these new technologies. Agribusinesses can also learn to use these technologies. I think another area that we don't think a lot about is irrigation. And irrigation Most of it takes place on the eastern shore, and it has been increasing over the last 20 years as far as the amount that is conducted. You look across the United States, it has shifted quite a lot. But as there is more rainfall or less rainfall, depending on the situation, and if it comes down in individual events and spaced in greater amounts, we may have to rely on irrigation. And states that don't currently rely on irrigation may have to start relying on irrigation to get a crop through the summer. The rainfall events also will change the salinity in the bay, likely, and we have seen some of that. And so that affects the sea life, including the seafood that we enjoy having for food. These weather events, we talk about the heavy rainfall, we know higher daytime temperatures are likely, but for the crops, what's really important is these higher nighttime temperatures as well. So that affects the productivity, also creates issues with the additional pests such as disease and insects that we would have. Because we've also got a longer season, there'll be more generations of those. Many of the crops can't be grown year after year after year. In fact, we don't promote that. We promote rotation into different crops. With this cycling, and especially for table crops, you have to have rotations where they're a little longer because of the disease pressure and the insect pressure. It helps alleviate that. So if right now we have a rotation that's 2 years or 2 years long, where you would maybe have a cereal crop and a vegetable crop or a fruit crop, watermelons, for example, over the years that has gotten longer. And now for watermelons, when I talked with somebody last week, they said the rotation length is 4 other crops and then watermelons. So really only 20% of the acreage on that farm is going to be able to be put into watermelons. The lack of cold temperatures can also allow pests to overwinter that we normally see die when it gets cold. And that won't just be here in Maryland, but that'll be in the Midwest. As it warms there, they really depend on extremely cold temperatures to drive down some of those pest problems. I think I'll stop there, Patty, and those are a few of the items.
Yeah, thank you. And one thing that you brought up during our earlier conversations that I found really interesting about kind of the uniqueness of the extension program, and you mentioned it briefly, was the applied research, right? That you guys are really taking what you're learning, seeing in the field, and encouraging farmers to use that. Did you want to expand on that at all?
Well, I can. We really are here to de-risk technologies, whether it's for the private sector, when they come out with something new or something from campus. So we have research and education centers spread out across the state. The faculty will take and conduct applied research using those products or technologies or services, whatever they might be, and look at what the problems might be with it, what the positive benefits are, and allow farmers to see it in the field. They really like to see things in the field, get their hands on it. Sometimes we're allowed to actually do hands-on demonstrations. And then when they adopt the practice, they have a good idea of what the risks and rewards are that go with that.
Great, thank you. The Nature Conservancy is working directly with farmers to find solutions and opportunities to support farmers and improve resiliency. Amy, could you please elaborate on this a bit? Help us connect the dots about how efforts to support agricultural production can have direct impact on the organization's environmental goals and your ability to achieve them.
Absolutely. So the Nature Conservancy, one of the ways that we work in most of everything we do is we partner with other organizations that make sense for us to achieve our goals. So with our work around nutrient management, we co-founded an organization called the 4R Alliance in the Chesapeake. And we work through that, which is a group of researchers. We have extension personnel on there. We have agribusinesses. We have state and federal nutrient management planners and experts on there to all come together and share solutions and ideas of how we can advance work around nutrient management and making it more better for the environment, but also better for the farmer and with the economics piece of it. And as John mentioned earlier, the cost of fertilizer has been skyrocketing. A lot of our inputs that we see now. So it's especially important right now. So I want to start with a few facts just to give you a sense of some of the opportunity that we see in this space. So the science is showing us that we know climate change is going to be affecting production of food, and it's going to increase yield volatility, which means that if a farmer does everything the same from year to year, it could result in a different amount of production that they're getting at the end of the year because of largely variations in climate and weather patterns. Another study that TNC was part of looked at insurance payments to farmers. And insurance payments to farmers due to drought rose more than 400% between 1995 and 2020 to $1.6 billion we were paying across the US. While payments due to excess moisture like floods rose nearly 300% to $2.61 billion. Now, the interesting part about this study, though, is that counties that had higher soil organic matter in their croplands were associated with greater amount of production of yield, lower loss of their crops, and lower rates of crop insurance payouts under drought. So you can connect the dots there that, if we build more resilient systems through better soil health and crop management practices, that can save farmers money by lowering the crop insurance costs and also the amount of times that they need to apply for that insurance and use that. And then the second example I'll give is around the nutrient management, and a study that was published just this year looked at what were the factors around nitrogen loss in fields. And it was largely the driving factors. Intensity of rainfall explained most of the variability with the nitrate leaching into the groundwater, into our streams. And then it found that the other factors, though, that we can control it are nitrogen rate, so the amount of nitrogen we're putting on, and also the amount of removal by the crop. And both of those farmers can control and make it more precise of how they're using fertilizer. And instead of, say, putting a large amount up front and maybe once through the year, of splitting it out much more throughout the year and more spoon feeding those nutrients. And again, that saves the farmer money they don't want to see that fertilizer washing away and losing that money. And it improves water quality with the loss of that nitrates to the water. And it also mitigates climate change because we're not having the greenhouse gases being emitted into the atmosphere as part of that process as well. So the bottom line is that improving soil health and more precision nutrient application using technologies, it saves the farmer money and it reduces losses to the environment. So it's definitely a win-win.
So you described, kind of an interesting example there, just in terms of how the farmers can apply, fertilizer in different ways than maybe they have before. Do you have any other examples about what techniques you think that tend to work really well in helping farmers adopt new technologies in the work that they're doing and other processes? Because it's, there's so much innovation coming out, and there's so many, people trying to approach farmers and say, I have a way to do things better. What works, and where do you find that farmers run into roadblocks?
Yeah. Well, I think, part of it is we know that every farm's unique and every farmer has to be able to pick practices and pick new technologies that are going to apply to his or her farm, right? And be able to learn how to incorporate that into their operation in a way that makes sense. As John was pointing out, it's much different for a small farmer than a large farmer. It could be the barriers are different, right? It could be barriers for access to equipment could be much different between different types of farmers. It could be access to technologies and the cost of those technologies, or it could be just limitations of labor and the time to implement certain practices. So I think we need to be flexible, and we need to, provide that support where it's needed. One of the areas I think is a really interesting way that we need to think more about is how we can think about new financial incentives that reduce risk. So as Darren was pointing out, we need to reduce risk of farmers trying these practices. And sometimes, it's a learning process, right? For them to figure out how to do it on their individual farm. And it could take them a couple of years to actually get it right, where we're getting, the cost savings, the environmental benefits, all of that works together. So are there financial mechanisms we could help to take away that risk? And, there's some really interesting products coming out around yield warranties and others of if you try new practices, that you can provide that backstop so that they can do that without risk of losing a lot of money potentially.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you for that. Darren, we've discussed a bit how climate change continues to test our region's capacity to reliably produce food as it has for decades. Yet the need to strengthen resilience has also opened up the need to identify solutions that may provide opportunities for economic growth. What are you seeing happen on the ground as farmers and others in the food system try to change to this try to adapt to the changing environment?
Well, I think one of the things that they are trying to do, and Amy just brought this up about learning. And so as the cover crop program was introduced in Maryland, and it is a very good program, the farmers have taken some time to learn in that process. And one of the things, for example, is planting green into the cover crop so they can leave the cover crop standing for longer and holding nutrients in place for longer, and then slow release as that organic matter breaks down, slowly release the nutrients back into the system. So, and that's something that the farmers have worked out and tried. Now, not every farmer is doing that. There are challenges to it, but they're working through that. So it's a learning process. One of the issues that we don't talk about very much is the land side of the equation and access to land. We have so much development going on in Maryland, and that usually takes farmland out of production. And so that reduces our ability to produce food. And it also creates an increase in costs for the farmers who are still farming, because you have higher demand for limited supply, maybe even the same demand for a limited supply of land. So therefore the rents go up as well. So that is an important factor in production here in Maryland, and actually across the US. I mean, I saw that in the Midwest as well, that the cities are spreading out, and it's very easy to build on green space that's open rather than something that already has buildings on it. Let's see here. I wanted to, that also, the development piece of the equation also affects the stormwater management part of things. And so because you have impervious surfaces, that too drives more pollution into the bay. And they have had a hard time getting control of that as far as managing that, because you have these big events and all of a sudden it pushes a lot of waste out into the bay, and then you don't have the events for a period of time. And so it's very difficult to manage that. I think that we'll be seeing a lot of technology brought about to address these issues. And we have been seeing that actually. So we've probably the last 10 to 20 years, we've seen a lot more ag technology investment, I would say, from not only the traditional players of the farm machinery, the seed companies, et cetera, but we're seeing it from venture capitalists. We're seeing it from from other types of investors, and entrepreneurs are thinking this is an exciting space, and they have been for probably, I would say, 10 years. And we're seeing some benefits of that now. Again, you have people saying, well, this is a great thing for the farmers, and that's why we want to test these things, because farmers get these types of offers all the time, and whether they should follow that offer, there are good opportunities out there, but I would not say that it's as often as you would like to see. So what we find is somebody comes out with the latest, greatest idea, and it may work in the lab, it may work even on small scale, but doesn't work in the field, and the farmers bear the brunt of that cost, and that's a problem for them. I think if you look at our manufacturing system in the agricultural sector, what happened in 2020 when the pandemic started was really about the inflexibility of our manufacturing systems. So we were producing the food, it was being produced on the farms. We were getting it to the processors when they wanted it, but they had a number of issues. They had labor issues because people were getting ill or afraid to come into work. The systems were not set up such that rather than making 5-gallon cartons of milk that can go to food service and 1-cup servings for schools, they couldn't make those anymore because that market wasn't open. The grocery store, you want half gallons, gallons, quarts, and they couldn't make that switch fast enough. So we saw things like dumping milk, etc. So I think resiliency in the food system is not just about farming, it's also in the manufacturing sector. When you look at a car factory, the way that they manufacture, there's not a whole string of cars of the same car with the same trim line and everything, all the same options going through. That's not the way it works. Each car is built with those options according to an order, and they're built one at a time in a sense, even though it's on a big assembly line. I would think that our manufacturers are going to have to think about that as far as for the food resiliency part of things. And John mentioned one other item, and that is the processing for animals, or the capacity. And we had capacity issues in that. We still have capacity issues in Maryland for that, and particularly for small producers. Wait times over a year to have an animal processed is a little on the long side. And we have people working on it, but it takes a lot to get through the regulations, as John said. It is highly regulated. So a producer can't just start up a shop. The other thing, even the local lockers and butchers couldn't scale up fast enough because they couldn't get enough skilled labor to do some of those. And they didn't have facilities either. So there were those types of things. I think another part of it is we need agricultural literacy needs to be improved as far as what's really going on out at the farms and how the food is produced and how it goes through the process and gets to people in the grocery store, at the farmer's market, or however they acquire their food. A lot of time they only see the end result, like when it gets to them. They need to see all those steps. And I think with that, they could see how much the effects, or what the effects are from a climate standpoint, I guess I would say it that way, and how we might be able to improve that. Because as John said, petroleum is a big part of this equation, and distribution is a big part of the equation. So that means energy going into the distribution system.
Thanks for connecting all those dots. There's nothing straightforward about this system at all, that's for sure. John, back to you. The need for new innovations often means that there's also the need for funding, and Amy brought this up earlier, funding to support research and development efforts and implementation and trials. Can you please share a little bit about what's on your mind these days with regards to funding priorities and where the gaps are in the system? After all, this isn't the first time we've had to address climate-related challenges here in the US, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think both Amy and Darren had hit on this. Going back to the discussion that farming is operates on farmers operate on razor thin margins. When you take a risk of adopting a new technology, a new process, or a new technique, you're always, as a farmer, you're worried, if I'm going to try something new, am I going to have a crop? Am I going to have livestock? Is my experiment going to yield a product that I can have something to go to market and pay my bills and my operating loans? So farmers are going to be very apprehensive to adopt new things on their own because of the risks that's associated. If they end up with a crop failure or don't have livestock that meets the spec, they can lose a lot of money, and that could be the difference between being in business and out of business. And so there's a few ways that we look at addressing how we adopt new technologies. And like you mentioned, let's look at the history books a little bit. We know that going back as far as the 1930s, during the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, that the farming community across the United States recognized the need to address environmental conservation. It was out of the Dust Bowl era that the movement of conservation management moved forward. And as a country, we work together particularly through Congress, but also local and state level governments to make investments in addressing environmental and ecological challenges that we're having at that period of time. And we've continued to do so over time. Two areas that we want to look at is for going forward and in the future of where we make investments. Number one, glad that Darren is here and representing the University of Maryland Extension and the University of Maryland as Maryland's flagship land grant institution. It was a long time ago where Congress in the United States made the decision to invest in the land grant system because we knew we needed to move that knowledge that was happening at our universities into the field, to rural communities, to farmers that did not have close access to the latest and greatest research and technology that was happening. And through cooperative extension, we've been able to do that. That investment and that initiative happened almost 100 years ago. And since that time, as with everything else that Congress funds, we've seen budget cuts and budget cuts and budget cuts. We know we need more qualified scientists doing that research and development at our land grant schools, extension specialists working hand in hand with farmers out in the field to try and experiment things in ways that, as Darren said, reduce risk for adopting new technologies. Our investment in our land grants is so important when it comes to trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work and trying to get our farming community to adopt new techniques. And I would say it's not just limited to our farming community. When we talk about the food chain, there's all sorts of partners involved, not just the farmer. While a lot of that starts on the farm, when you look at where the food goes when it leaves the farm gate until it gets to your dinner table or your restaurant at the evening, there's a lot of partners involved in getting that food there. And our land grant system is a way to engage people in trying to test new things. Amy talked about the incentives that we can provide to farmers, particularly when we look at programs like the Farm Bill that Congress passes every 5 years, and the conservation title, what we call, if you're a policy wonk, Title II in the U.S. Farm Bill, which is the conservation title. We talk about the incentive programs through the United States Department of Agriculture, Natural Resources Conservation Service, cost share program. Both at the federal level and at the state level. One of the things that we always hold up is the foresight that the state of Maryland and our government officials and our public had in making early investments into cost share programs. Here in Maryland, we call that the MAX program, one of several programs that we incentivize farmers to adopt what we call best management practices, like cover crops, like no-till farming, like riparian buffers, all these things to say we will pay the farmers to change their farming practices, invest in new practices, whether it's equipment or farming practices that will yield benefit to the public. That benefit is reduced nutrient load to bodies of water, to streams, rivers, and the Chesapeake Bay, that improve, as Amy pointed out, healthy soils. When we increase the organic matter of our soil, we increase the ability of that soil to absorb water and hold water and absorb nutrients and make those nutrients bioavailable to those plants that are being planted there. And how livestock use the landscape going forward. So Maryland has been at the forefront of trying to create these incentive programs to protect the public assets of the state of Maryland, our natural resources, streams, rivers, bays, forests, the land, all those types of things. And the same thing we look at with Congress. Actually, we saw over the weekend, Congress passed a bill, a major piece of bill that provides a significant amount of funding to conservation programs through USDA. So we can find ways to work together through public-private partnerships to incentivize the increased adoption of conservation practices. So two ways, I'd say three ways to do it. State investment, which we have a great model for here in the state of Maryland, federal investments through the Farm Bill or other incentive programs through our partners at the federal level, and the third investment through our land grant systems, land grant universities, and cooperative extension systems. And so we can create this great ecosystem of people working together and incentivizing the type of practices that have been proven to benefit, number one, food production, and number two, conservation management.
Awesome. Thank you for all that great information. I'm gonna tweak the subject here a little bit. We're gonna jump over to food prices. They continue to rise. You know, making nutritious, affordable food is kind of increasingly out of reach for many people. Some argue that that's the reason, or that's the result of the threat of inflation, while others argue that it's the result of retailers or others in the supply chain taking advantage of the opportunity to raise prices. Heard a story today that the cost of eating out has actually gone up less than the cost of buying food at the grocery store, because you have to eat, but you don't have to eat out. So restaurants are kind of not they're taking the hit a little bit more. So given the competing pressures on the food system from environmental changes, supply chain challenges caused by COVID, other market pressures, what do you all think needs to happen for food prices to stabilize or even go down? And this is open to all of you, so please jump in.
Yeah, I'll add to this, and that is kind of the first question you asked me. A few things. Labor costs and energy costs contribute significantly to the price of food in this country and really around the world. In addition to that, you have the transportation logistics. How does food get from the farm to your dinner plate at night? And then you do have people that take a markup as food moves from the farm to your dinner plate. The transportation costs, the manufacturing costs, the marketing costs. So if we're talking about packaged food, those people who are responsible for marketing that food and advertising that food, they're the cost there. The retail costs, the grocery stores or bodegas or the restaurants. So everybody's taking a little piece of the food dollar. But the two biggest things that impact are fuel and labor, and trying to figure out how we address both of those as a country, as a world, is something that we need to tackle. We know what the labor challenges are. Here in Maryland and across the country, we use a lot of H-2A and H-2B immigrant labor, legal workforce that comes outside of the borders of the United States. The ability for farmers to access a workforce and do it in a way that protects workers' interests and meets our food demands is very challenging due to the regulations involved in getting that workforce to the places that it needs to go. And energy, there's a lot of competing interests in how we address our energy needs and accessing affordable energy, but those are two ways to look at it. I'll also, challenge our audience to think about this because we're in a unique place as most of us living here in the United States, is that still at the end of the day, when we look at populations around the globe, it is those who live here in the United States that have the most affordable food supply in the world. We spend around 10% of our disposable income to feed ourselves every single day, every single year. And that is pretty low compared to the rest of the world. Most of the world spends a lot more to access nutrition. And so we're in a really fortunate situation. I don't say that to make light of the situation that we've been in recently, that food costs for everyone have gone up recently, but we know that those are from other logistical challenges that are there. And so I think we work with our legislatures, state and federal, to find ways to address those two big needs, labor and energy, and finding ways to bring those. And then I would also say that goes into transportation, labor and energy in transportation as well, because we saw that during COVID. Do we have enough truck drivers to move food places, rail, ship, all those things, whether it was having the actual transportation vessels to move things or the operators to actually move food. I think it just boils down to energy and labor.
Thank you. Darren, Amy, do you have anything you'd like to add for that around the question of, what do you think needs to happen for food prices to stabilize or go down?
Only that I agree with John that puts it in context of where we are. It isn't hard for people, but it's harder in other places. Maybe we'll say it that way. And I believe, and I think this is somewhat of what John was alluding to, is that we're going to have to depend on innovation to drive out energy costs, reduce the amount of energy we use in these systems, the nutrients that we use in the system. Somehow we use those. Amy mentioned this earlier, using those more efficiently. But there are difficulties in spreading out application of fertilizer, for example, throughout the season. Just getting through the field, because of the way that we have some of our production practices that have other positive effects, makes it very hard to go down through the field after around the 1st of July. So those are issues, though, that we'll have to work our way through. That innovation, though, is we really have to have that ecosystem for the innovation side. Now, John talked about ecosystem for the food system as a whole, but that small piece, I think, is really important to support the entrepreneurs and the researchers who develop technologies that entrepreneurs grab out of the university system or other systems, federal system, et cetera, and bring those in to use and drive that forward, creating a successful business or successful technology that can be acquired by somebody else, whatever the case might be, to improve and either the quality or reduce the cost of the system.
Amy, would you like to add anything before we go to Q&A?
Yeah, I think John and Darren covered that really well. Anything to add?
All right, fantastic. So, I can certainly kind of keep going through some questions, but I definitely want to give you all an opportunity to ask your questions in the chat. We really have some awesome experts in the room, and while you're typing up your questions, or if you want to take yourself off mute, I'll use this opportunity for a shameless plug that if you're interested here in the food system, we do have 2 more sessions coming up for this summer speaker series. Next week, we're going to have a session on the topic of reduced biodiversity and its impact on our food system. And then on Tuesday, the 23rd, we're going to have a session on, much to what's been discussed here today, the innovations needed to support our food system in the future. So I'm going to go ahead and put the link to both of these in the chat. This will also be the page where you can find the summary of this session and past sessions. The recording will also be posted on there as well. John, Darren, Amy, what have I not asked? Like, when we're thinking about kind of the economic input, economic effect of all of this, like, what do you really think people need to know about what's happening here? I mean, you've said a lot, so maybe we've covered it all, but
well, I think, Patty, I think Franz has a good question here, and John has answered this in the chat. But I think that those types of systems that are vertical farming type systems, and I won't limit it to vertical only, but controlled environment agriculture systems that we have, it's exciting to be able to grow food in the location where it's going to be used, because a lot of these folks are looking at putting those systems in place in Baltimore, in Montgomery County, in Prince George's County, where the people are. And it will take a special type of workforce. It isn't the common farm labor that is going to be working there. They're going to have people who actually can run high-tech equipment. So I think there'll be training opportunities in that way, and higher dollar jobs available to people. So those are, I would think, very positive things. I would say that Maryland used to be a powerhouse in the horticultural industry. Not that we're not today, but on the food side in particular, we were a big canning state back until the 1950s, when things started to move west. We couldn't control the environment as well when you go to the desert and are able to water anytime you want to water, and you don't have to worry about disease issues as badly as we have here. So I think we need to look at innovation to be able to bring some of those things back here. Our farmers want to grow a variety of crops. They like growing whatever they think can generate income and serve the community, but that's got to be profitable for them. And so that's one thing. As we see some of these issues come to light that John and Amy brought up, and you, Patty, as well, on the climate change, is some of the techniques that we use right now to control disease or insects depend on being effective. And as they get used more, they become less effective over time. And we're not seeing as much innovation on the development of new technologies in those particular applications as we'd like to see. There are some, but the biologicals that come out are not as effective as the synthetics that we see as far as pesticides. We'd like to see that better, or strategies that allow them to perform at a level that the farmer can still get a good crop and be profitable. So there's work to be done in that area.
Yeah, definitely. We do have a couple of questions coming in. Are you seeing any problems or issues with pollination services by honeybees or other pollinators?
I'll add one from a services, and this is on the innovation, and I wish the company was still around. And I'll give you an example of how organizations like Farm Bureau are making investments in innovation. A few years ago, almost 3 years ago, we had two master's degree students in the Baltimore area compete in a program that we have at the American Farm Bureau level called the Ag Innovation Challenge. There was a company in which two young people got together and said, hey, well, I've got, one of them has an expertise in agriculture and working with pollinators, with bees in particular. Another one had an interest in technology. And they came up with this idea for, in their terms, they called it Uber for bees. And it was a company called Hiveland. And Hiveland said, all right, we know that there's people who raise bees as part of production. They raise bees to rent hives out to farmers who need pollinators. And they said, hey, we know that bees are more likely to thrive when they're not transported more than 30 miles away from their home base. So let's create a system, an online app that will connect people who are raising bees and farmers who need them, and figure out how to, using technology, to move bees to places where pollination was needed. It was a wonderful program, and they were a national finalist, and they were from Maryland, and we supported them and invested in their companies. Unfortunately, they were both young professionals, and they started their business and then decided, hey, we're going to move on to something else. But we are seeing innovation happening in pollinators. There is ongoing challenges, as many people have heard, about keeping the pollination population alive. We're making tons of headway in there, and Darren can speak to it. We're seeing research at University of Maryland and saying, hey, the bee population and pollinator populations are thriving. We've got to find a way to, number one, keep people interested in producing pollinators and providing habitat, whether it's commercial habitat or wildlife habitat in those areas. But Farm Bureau is very proud to back a homegrown startup here in Maryland in the Baltimore area that developed a new technology to get pollinators out to farms where it was actually needed.
And John, those programs are really important to foster the ecosystem for the entrepreneurs, because it gives them a little bit of money, and they can stretch money a long way usually. That's just part of the culture of that. As far as the bees, we're seeing it is a big issue. And so I was at a field day 2 weeks ago, I guess it was, and talking about that with some horticultural producers. And these were tree crop producers, so apples, peaches, etc. And for them, their suppliers, or if they had their own bees, I mean, some of them losing up to half of their colony over the winter. I mean, it just makes for a very difficult situation to keep that up as far as producing enough bees and having enough growth to keep up with the loss on that. And that's a cost. They are working on what those issues are. It's not a simple one issue. It's multiple issues. And so that's what's making it a complex problem to work on and solve.
Absolutely. And, you know, for all the prospective founders out there, hearing what John said about that bee company, you know, it sounds like there's a business model waiting for someone to come and pick it up. So keep that in mind. We've got a question here wondering whether or not we can ever be persuaded that, you know, here in Maryland, we don't have to eat blueberries in January. I mean, we're addressing transportation costs. What do you guys think about that?
I would twist that around a little bit, Sylvia, and I would say, how do we store the berries long enough or create systems where the shelf stability is good enough that we can store them throughout the whole winter in an energy efficient way, and we can have our blueberries throughout the year? That is the type of thing that I think we need to be thinking about. Companies are working on shelf life, and they have been for a long time. It is very expensive though right now, the way that it's set up, but there are ways we store apples that way and they last throughout the winter. So I think we can do that for other crops. It's just, are people going to be willing to pay the higher prices necessary to do that? And can we create systems that are more efficient, and so we don't have to raise those prices to compensate for the storage systems?
I'll add just an interesting note I found recently. There was a study out of Penn State, and they were looking at people's or consumers' perceptions of local foods, you know, and why they value local foods. And there was this overall thought that local food translates or is equivalent to cheaper food, right? Because it's more local, that it doesn't have to travel. But a lot of times that isn't the case, right? And I think we do have to just, as consumers, be willing to pay a little more for locally produced items and to support our local farmers and what they are producing, and allow them to diversify and provide more options. And I think that could also translate into people valuing, you know, local foods, and when it is in season, and enjoying that experience too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, we are at 3, you know, we set aside 90 minutes for this, so I'm not, you know, kicking anyone out at any point, but I do want to make sure, you know, kind of the panelists, we do have one more question. All right. You guys good for another question? Hanging in there? All right. We'll do one more. Like everything else, farming is a complex system. I am an ecosystems legislative justice advocate. Thank you for being here, Lee. I truly believe we would all be happier, healthier, and safer if we moved from factory farms to local, mostly family and small farmer, and more resilient systems. Maybe paying for organic rather than charging for USDA to say you are an organic farmer. It would mitigate the transportation problems, the food would be more nutritious, and we could push agriculture in schools again. Is there any support for giving farmers support for this?
Yeah, let me address that. One of the things that we do know is that around 96 to 98% of all farms here in Maryland and across the United States are family owned and operated. And so that's one thing that we really need to know, that less than 2% of the US population is actually engaged in the profession of farming and raising or growing our food. It's a very, very small community, and it's a community that we work tirelessly to support. And so when we talk about the size and scope of a farm, you could have a family, and Maryland's a great example, because we have farms here in the state that predate the founding of the United States as a country. So we've got many, many generations. And when you need to support a family for many generations, the size and scope of your farm may grow. And that's part of the American dream, to be able to grow your own family business. But by and large, the majority of our farms are family owned and operated. And finding ways to support that family legacy is the best way to keep production going. Organic is one way that we do that. One of the challenges that we're seeing with organic production isn't not that consumers want it, it's compliance again, regulations. And I think that the person who asked the question asked a good one. If you want that certified organic label from USDA, there is a lot of paperwork, a lot of red tape, a lot of waiting time for what amounts to a marketing label. And so what we're seeing more and more of, and I was actually at a farm on the Eastern Shore the other week, a family saying, we are producing food in an organic way. And we're saying, hey, this is organically produced food because we're using organic practices. But we just don't see the value of going through all the red tape, time, and costs to get that organic certification. And they say, our community knows who we are. Our family has farmed in this area for a long time. They know and trust, and they can see how we're growing our produce and our livestock here on our farm. So we're not so concerned that we get that official label from USDA, but what we want to build a relationship with the consumers in our community, and we're being very transparent in how we grow and raise our food. And so I think Amy addressed it great by saying, support your local farmers. Number one, get to know who the farmers are in your community. Often most people don't know or build a relationship, but there are people that live in your community, go to your churches, their kids go to your same school as your kids go to school. And so build those relationships with that very small part of our population that spends their entire day raising and growing food. We live in a country where we like to get our food how we want, when we want it, anytime we want it. And so think about where it comes from, support those local growers, local restaurants, the people that are working on it. But we by and large have, and for a long time, have a farming community that is family owned and operated. And we do rely on other partners in the food supply chain to make sure that your food stays safe, stays healthy, and gets to you when you want it. When you're in lockdown and you got to hit that Uber Eats button so food comes to your front door, so you're doing that in a safe way, we rely on a lot of partners to do.
Do you have any resources that you all could recommend on how folks could find the local farms?
That's a good one. I know there's definitely ones for specific types, like you pick farms, and there's some of the dairy, I'm thinking maps and the wineries and things like that. I don't know of a universal site, but maybe John or Darren do. That kind of combines everything.
I don't think there's one for all farmers, for example.
No, but I would.
It is for farmers markets and locally produced foods. At MDA has that. I believe has it. Well, they have a directory because I have a copy of that. So there are resources available.
I'd also like to point out 1,000 Eco Farms. Are you all familiar with that organization? I'm going to put the link in the chat for folks. They may be of interest for those sort of looking for local farms near them. They sort of have a larger map.
Yeah, Patty, I put a link in the chat also. The Maryland Department of Agriculture, as Darren alluded to, has a program called Maryland's Best. And that highlights Maryland grown and raised food across the state. So Google Maryland's Best or go to the Maryland Department of Agriculture website. And then also check out your local farmers market for great places to find locally produced and raised food.
Absolutely. And we'll send links out of these organizations shared in the chat when we send out the recording for this for everyone who registered. Any final words? Anything you want to leave with? I could ask a leading question, but I'll just throw it to you guys.
Let me add this, and I get this question a lot, but I want folks to know that Maryland farmers in our farming community are willing and helpful partners in addressing climate change challenges, food security challenges. We're here to help provide solutions to the biggest challenges facing our society today. Food is something that brings people together. So get to know your local farmer, farms in your local community, because these are people that have been trying for a long time to improve how we provide great food in ways that continue to find ways to improve our footprint on the environment. we've done a lot over the years. We recognize that there's a lot more that we need to do as a farming community to continue to improve how we care for our natural resources while meeting the needs of hungry people here at home and across the world. And so we're here working with our partners like the Nature Conservancy, like University of Maryland and Extension, to make sure that we're being responsible in how we're meeting the food, fiber, and renewable fuel needs for everyone, not only just here in Maryland, but all over the place. And so the farming community is here to be a partner, and we want people to know that that we're here to work together with folks to make sure that we get all that done.
Thank you. Amy?
And I'll add on to that is, farming, I agree, is they're on board, they're willing to do what we need. And there's a couple things I think that are critical. Is agriculture is our largest land use in the Chesapeake Bay, largest managed land use. And we want to keep it that way. We want farmers to stay farming. So I think we need to value our farmers. We need to support them to make these changes and adapt to our climate conditions. And we can't restore the Chesapeake without them. It's not in our minds, it's just not an option, of if we'll be successful or not. We know we won't. So we need to find ways to meet them where they are and make it work for their operation to remain sustainable and find those practices that work. And I'll leave with, one interesting statistic that we found in a recent survey we did on Delmarva of agricultural landowners. And we were asking about restoration and their interest in restoration. And 40% of the respondents of that survey said they weren't even aware there were programs that would help them restore areas on their farms and on their agricultural lands. So we have an awareness or education problem there, I think. And then secondly, is that when we ask, well, do you want to give us your personal contact information to find out more about opportunities to restore places on your farm? 63% of the respondents gave us their phone number or email to contact them. So again, to John's point, they're willing, right? And they're interested in doing this. We need more capacity. And as Darren was saying, we need more extension agents, and we need more conservation district staff, and we need the private sector and public sectors and everybody working together and, to solve this problem and to have a thriving agricultural system and have them producing food for all of us.
And I think in Maryland, we have a model, at least partially in place, where those do work together, as that Amy was talking about, and John talked about partnering. We all work with a number of organizations to try to solve some of these issues and do it in a smart way, so that people can be successful, and not just the farmers, because the farmers, it's one piece of the equation. John, as John said, there's a whole value chain of people that depend on those farms. We also, as consumers, depend on those farms. And then in the watershed, you have the aquaculture part of the equation that depends on it. Depends on the land-based farming doing their job and not affecting them, at least minimize the effect. So we are used to working together. We have projects in which we have large teams from many organizations to work on those. So if there are things that you think we need to be doing, get in touch. And I'm sure that I can speak for John and Amy. They would be willing to listen about partnering on ideas that would help with climate mitigation and preservation of our natural resources.
Sounds like we need all the help we can get in all the ways. One last question I just saw come in, so we'll close it up after this. Is there interest in opening up more of the ag reserve here in Montgomery County? Do you guys know?
I would direct you to County Council in Montgomery County for our Farm Bureau members that are part of the Montgomery County Farm Bureau. The idea for the longest time is to ensure that there is open land, what we call workable land for agricultural production. And so I don't know if the community in Montgomery County said, hey, part of that land should be used for food processing and food manufacturing. But as we deal with continued urban sprawl and development and growth, we want, part of the idea behind the ag reserve is preserving land for farming, for agricultural production. So I would encourage you to reach out to county council or the Montgomery County Farm Bureau or people there in Montgomery County that can answer that question a little bit better. But the intent was, let's save some land so that we can grow and raise food in Montgomery County.
So John, as a Farm Bureau member in Montgomery County, I'm going to say that since that's where I live, I would say that they do have local foods produced in the reserve right now. And I've been at a number of the farms that do that. We also have a strong nursery industry, and we don't talk about that as part of the climate mitigation system. But Maryland has a very strong ornamental horticulture system in place, or industry in place. And that too is important to the climate mitigation, planting green trees, plants, what have you. And so, and Montgomery County has a large part of that industry because they're close to the population in both directions, north and south. So, but I think there are a number of producers producing food crops in that area, and there are corn and soybeans grown there as well. But it's because of the location to the population. There are a lot of pick your own operations. There are operations that are supplying institutions, et cetera. So could there be more? Definitely, there's that potential. And also I think Montgomery County is one of those where there's an opportunity for the vertical farming. So keep that in mind as well. It's not just what's in the ag preserve.
Awesome. Well, on that note, I would just like to say thank you again, John, Darren, Amy, for joining this afternoon, for sharing your wisdom, your experience. I always learn a lot on these sessions, and this one was no exception. So thank you. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We will have the recording out soon and a written summary in the next few weeks. And again, I hope you join some of our future sessions. The topics there's a lot to discuss on these topics. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and stay in touch. Thank you all.
Thanks, Patty.
Thank you, Patty.